Before 17 million viewers, J.D. Vance humiliated Jasmine Crockett on live TV. 2 days later, she answered with a $100 million lawsuit and explosive evidence. But what words caught on a secret mic shattered everything he built. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room felt like a fortress, tall white stone columns, the Congress seal hanging heavy behind the dais, and cameras pointed straight ahead like loaded guns. 17 million Americans were watching live. Jasmine Crockett stood at the mic surrounded by binders and a thick folder stamped emergency Medicaid impact. Her tone was steady, but her words cut sharp. These cuts will take health care from over 12 million poor children. They won't disappear from your spreadsheets. They'll show up in ERs with untreated infections and broken bodies. Behind her, staffers shifted uneasily. She raised a CDC chart, red bars climbing like a scream. This isn't about saving money. It's about who gets to live and who gets left behind. Her eyes held firm, unshaken, even as whispers spread across the Republican seats. Then came J.D. Vance. The vice president, wrapped in a charcoal suit, adjusted his mic without looking up. The budget, he said with his usual drawl, is not a place for sad stories. Gasps broke through the room. Vance stayed stone still. We're not here to pay for trauma tales. We're here to fix the system. He leaned in, lips curling into a smirk. And honestly, Congresswoman, the government isn't your therapy couch. A few aides laughed quietly into their folders. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her eyes hardened. The jab didn't just ignore her facts, it twisted her compassion into a weakness. As if rehearsed, Vance dropped the real blow. These so-called support programs are nothing but a financial circus, he declared. An emotional stunt from a party scared of numbers and hooked on crisis. The words hit like a slap. One senator whispered, "Did he really say that?" Others scribbled notes, reporters hammering keyboards like gunfire. Vance leaned back proud. It sounded scripted, but the damage was real. He had just painted healthcare for children as a sideshow. And Jasmine Crockett, the only black woman at that table, had been cast as the ringleader of waste. Outside the chamber, the internet erupted. Twitter dug up old clips of J.D. Vance in 2022, mocking childless women as cat ladies who only wanted handouts because they don't know real responsibility. Now those clips ran side by side with today's footage, a vice president calling kids' healthcare a clown show. The storm was building. Jasmine Crockett was still standing tall, but the ground itself was shaking. And it wasn't her voice that trembled, it was the system's. And yet, just when the room thought it had heard the worst, Jasmine Crockett calmly flipped to the next page in her folder. The tremor in the chamber hadn't peaked. It was only beginning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of what she carried did the lifting. Jasmine held up a printed report from the Urban Institute, the thick paper rigid in her gloved hands, its contents highlighted in the kind of angry red only pain could produce. This report, she began, her voice slow and precise, like the tightening of a noose, projects that over 12 million children across this country will lose their health insurance if this budget passes. Her eyes moved deliberately, locking with senators from red states: Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia. States with the highest child poverty rates. That's 12 million lives, she repeated, firmer now, reduced to collateral damage in a war against the poor. She let the words hang. Behind her, an LED screen flickered to life, illuminating a United States map bathed in shades of red. The darker the color, the deeper the suffering. These are not projections created by activists or pundits, she continued. They're verified, peer-reviewed, data-driven figures from one of the most respected nonpartisan think tanks in the country. The chamber was quiet but not peaceful. It was the silence of something about to crack. This is not conjecture. This is impact, she said, each word spaced like a drumbeat. Real, measurable, harm. Her hand trembled slightly as she tapped the report's binding, but her voice never did. In the seats behind her, an aide held back tears. Somewhere in the third row, a Republican senator slowly uncrossed his arms. Jasmine Crockett was not pleading. She was prosecuting, presenting evidence, not of politics, but of consequence. You can ignore me, she said, but you will not ignore these numbers. And then across the long lacquered table, J.D. Vance exhaled and laughed. It started as a low, almost performative scoff, but grew louder, more deliberate, and more cruel with every syllable. If their parents had real jobs, he said none of those kids would be losing insurance in the first place. The words detonated in the room like a nail bomb. Chairs shifted, mouths dropped. A reporter stopped typing. The oxygen seemed to vanish. Crockett didn't respond right away. Her jaw tightened, but her spine didn't bend. She stared straight ahead like someone who had been preparing for this precise kind of violence her entire life. "What did you just say?" a female senator whispered, too shocked to control the volume. Others began murmuring, voices laced with disbelief and fury. The hum in the chamber turned into a static roar. One congressional aide put their head in their hands. Another recorded the moment on a hidden phone. Crockett said nothing, not yet, but her hands, now resting on the folder, gripped the edges like the wood beneath her might snap from the force. Vance leaned back as if he'd just made a clever joke at a private dinner party. "This is what happens," he added smugly, "when a generation is taught that government is their father and the hospital is their inheritance." This time there were no gasps, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after someone is slapped so hard it takes a moment to register the pain. The kind of stillness that is in itself a scream. It wasn't just dismissiveness anymore. It was a full-throated indictment of the poor, the working class, and everyone who has ever walked into a clinic with a Medicaid card and a prayer. The cruelty wasn't passive, it was theatrical, designed not only to dismiss but to humiliate. Crockett's breath slowed. Her face was still, but her silence was volcanic. You could see it behind her eyes, the rising of something vast and ancient and deadly calm. She didn't need to respond. The room had already turned. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Even those who privately agreed with Vance avoided his gaze. And outside those walls, America began to speak back. Within minutes, Twitter exploded. J.D. Vance's 2021 Fox News interview resurfaced like a ghost kicking down the door. The clip played on loop, Vance sneering as he declared that poor Americans should be subject to what he called a laziness tax. The quote, "Maybe it's time we tax laziness instead of labor." Now, that same man had just claimed that children lose health care because their parents don't have real jobs. The connection was unmistakable. This wasn't a slip. It was a pattern, an ideology sharpened into a weapon and aimed at the vulnerable. In the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett remained standing. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, but she didn't sit down either. She held the Urban Institute report in her hand like a shield not made of steel, but of truth, and for a moment it was stronger than anything power could muster. The war had begun, not over numbers, but over what it meant to be seen as human. The silence that followed wasn't the calm after a storm, it was the inhale before the next explosion, and J.D. Vance had already lit the fuse with a grin. He didn't let her finish. Jasmine Crockett had just begun presenting a follow-up case study, a real story of a 10-year-old boy in rural Louisiana who relied on Medicaid to survive chronic asthma. When Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowed, voice cutting through the chamber like a serrated knife. "Miss Crockett does not represent the working class," he snapped. The room shifted, heads turned, cameras tilted slightly instinctively, zooming in. "She represents TikTok wigs and delusional politics." The insult didn't echo, it detonated. The words fell like acid into the room's bloodstream, and even before anyone could react, the weight of it had already settled on every shoulder present. Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch. But her stillness was louder than fury. It was defiance coiled and precise. Gasps hissed from the Democratic side like pressure escaping a cracked valve. One congresswoman rose to her feet, lips parting in outrage. A second followed, hand raised, ready to object formally. But before either could speak, Vance extended one palm without turning his head and shut them down with the same theatrical cruelty. "She's not testifying," he said coldly. "She's performing." That final sentence, "she's performing," struck with surgical intent. It didn't just challenge Jasmine's arguments. It sought to erase her legitimacy entirely, to reduce her existence, her voice, her presence in that room to nothing more than a stage act. Not a public servant, not a policymaker, just a spectacle. But just when the weight of the last insult had barely begun to settle, J.D. Vance leaned forward again, this time, not with a smirk, but with sharpened contempt. He knew exactly what he was doing now. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was character assassination broadcast live to a nation on edge. His voice cracked like a rifle shot across marble. "You are not Rosa Parks," he said, each word slicing through the chamber with surgical precision. "You're an Instagram version of a dream that died a long time ago." The impact was immediate, violent in its stillness. A collective inhale rippled across the rows of witnesses, lawmakers, aides, and journalists, but no one spoke. No one moved. The blow was too precise, too cruel. It wasn't just a personal attack, it was a calculated attempt to sever Jasmine Crockett from the very lineage she stood upon. He hadn't simply dismissed her voice. He had tried to delete her from history, to reduce her presence to a filtered thumbnail of borrowed legacy. And he did it on the record, on federal ground, under oath. A camera zoomed in instinctively, centering on Jasmine's face. Her expression was frozen, not in shock, but in something more primal. It was the silence of someone who had heard this kind of venom before, who had learned to stand in its fire without burning. Her jaw locked. Her gaze didn't shift. Not even a single blink betrayed her. She didn't look at Vance. She looked through him, as if the structure of what he represented was already collapsing in her mind. Around her aides, stiffened fingers curled into fists. One senator's lips moved silently, mouthing words that never made it to air. The entire room sat in a paralysis of moral nausea, unsure if they'd just witnessed a political exchange or an act of spiritual desecration. The attack wasn't random, it was a culmination. For years, J.D. Vance had flirted with rhetoric that hollowed out movements he didn't understand. In 2023, during a right-wing podcast appearance, he declared the civil rights movement has been turned into theater. That comment back then had ignited a 48-hour social media firestorm before it faded under newer headlines. But now, with Crockett standing in flesh and blood, he had taken that sentiment and hammered it into her spine. This wasn't just about disagreeing with policy. This was ideological vandalism. He was accusing her of cosplay, of appropriating a dead dream to build a brand. He had called her a fraud, not with data, but with disdain. And yet, in that split second after his words dropped, Jasmine Crockett didn't shatter. She didn't react. She refused to react. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, the kind of silence that holds back a tidal wave, because the world doesn't deserve to see it crash just yet. But in her stillness, you could feel the room recalibrate. Lawmakers looked at each other, not with confusion, but with rising disbelief. The cameras stayed tight on her face. And across the country, the audience, watching from couches, classrooms, lunch breaks, and hospital waiting rooms, knew they had just witnessed something bigger than insult. They had seen the exact moment when the mask of respectability slipped and cruelty stood naked at the microphone. And Jasmine was still standing. She didn't shout. She didn't storm out. She didn't meet cruelty with chaos. Jasmine Crockett let the silence speak that day, and it roared through the country. But what came next wasn't silence at all. It was steel, and it came exactly 48 hours later, not in the form of a rebuttal, but in the form of a legal document that would send shockwaves through the American political system. At precisely 9:04 a.m. in the heart of Washington, D.C., her attorneys walked into the U.S. District Court carrying a binder, The Weight of Reckoning. The case was filed under Federal Jurisdiction Civil Division, Crockett vs. Vance. The complaint was 74 pages long, dense, calculated, and brutal in its clarity. It accused Vice President J.D. Vance of public defamation, made with malicious intent and rooted in racial and political prejudice, all delivered on a live, nationally televised government broadcast. The filing read not like political theater, but like a forensic report on humiliation, that his language was intended to inflict reputational harm, that his attacks were neither policy critique nor protected speech, and that he had crossed a line so clear the Constitution itself had no interest in shielding him. These weren't opinions. They were legal blades. At the center of the suit was one number: $100 million, $25 million for direct damages, career injury, personal distress, and targeted public shaming. But the second number was sharper: $75 million in punitive damages, calculated not only to punish Vance, but to send a message. A message that would echo into every Senate chamber, committee room, and national hearing power: is not a license to dehumanize. Crockett's lawyers wrote it like a manifesto. This action is not merely for redress. It is to establish that intentional racial degradation has no refuge in the architecture of American democracy, not even in the vice president's chair. Reporters swarmed the courthouse within the hour. Flash bulbs lit the stairs. Anchors rushed to live feeds. Legal experts were summoned to comment before the ink had dried, because it was unprecedented not just historically, but structurally. No sitting vice president had ever been sued by a sitting member of Congress for personal misconduct in a live hearing. Yet Crockett's legal team was ready. They cited landmark cases, Gravel versus United States, affirming that speech outside the legislative process is not immune. Hutchinson versus Proxmire, proving public figures cannot weaponize the First Amendment as a shield for personal defamation. These were not obscure footnotes. They were torpedoes. And then came the line that turned the case from bold to seismic. The complaint argued that J.D. Vance, in using a televised hearing to launch an intentional racialized character attack, had acted outside his constitutional role and thus outside his immunity. It was a surgical argument and one that legal scholars couldn't ignore. The moment those words were filed, Crockett's lawsuit became more than an act of resistance. It became a threat to the myth of untouchability. The vice president had laughed. He had insulted her wig. He had likened her activism to cosplay. But now he was no longer above the consequences. And as the news broke, a phrase began trending online, as if the country itself had reached a verdict before the court she filed, what he couldn't fight the truth. The lawsuit had detonated across the Capitol like a depth charge, but J.D. Vance didn't retreat, he reloaded. 48 hours after the filing, with cameras now chasing him instead of following, he stepped behind a podium outside the West Wing, flanked by American flags and silence so rehearsed it felt manufactured. His jaw was tight, his cufflinks gleamed, and the smirk that once adorned his face in the hearing room had been replaced by something colder, calculation dressed as calm. Politics. Vance began, voice slow and measured, as not a space for wounded feelings. He didn't blink. He let the words breathe like poison in a still room. We cannot allow public discourse to become a therapy session for the emotionally fragile. He looked directly into the sea of cameras, his expression locked in the classic stoicism of a man used to dominance, a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. This is not bullying. This is governing. And if my tone made anyone uncomfortable, perhaps they are in the wrong profession. His words echoed with the forced gravitas of someone defending not truth, but ego. And yet, for all his effort to appear composed, the cracks were already showing, just not in his voice. In the footage, because by the time he reached the fourth sentence, a different story had already begun to circulate. On every major network, on every phone, on every screen in every newsroom, a six-angle, multi-camera splice of the congressional hearing had gone viral, pulled from C-SPAN press feeds, freelance journalists, and even a handheld stream from a congressional aide. And it showed something J.D. Vance never expected the public to see in full: him, red-faced, teeth clenched, jabbing his finger across the bench at Jasmine Crockett with visible fury. It captured his voice rising an octave. It caught the vein in his neck pulsing. It showed the moment he lurched forward in his chair, his posture no longer that of a calm policymaker, but of a man unhinged. Every angle told the same story. This wasn't governance. It was rage wearing a title. A slowed-down version of the footage revealed the twitch in his right hand as he leaned toward her desk, lips curled back in something that no press secretary could spin. Side-by-side comparisons flooded social media. His line, "Politics is not a space for wounded feelings," played in split screen next to footage of him pointing, sneering, shouting. One outlet looped it under the headline, "Calm men don't point like this." Another simply aired it raw, unedited, titled, "Only the Vice President Unmasked." And Jasmine. She hadn't said a word since the lawsuit. She didn't need to, because now the nation had seen what she'd seen, and they didn't just hear the insult, they saw the face that delivered it. And as the footage of J.D. Vance's outburst tore through every feed and fiber of public consciousness, the silence from Capitol Hill's power brokers fractured and turned into fury. The very next morning, three of the most prominent progressive voices in Congress acted in unison. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar each signed a blistering letter addressed to the House Committee on Ethics, printed on official stationery, and hand-delivered with cameras trailing every step. The letter wasn't diplomatic, it was fire on paper. The vice president's behavior constitutes not only a breach of decorum it began, but a calculated assault on the dignity of a sitting member of Congress, and by extension, the community she represents. They demanded immediate review, they demanded disciplinary action, and they demanded something rare in Washington moral courage. This institution cannot afford the luxury of silence, the letter read. No one, not even the vice president, has the right to weaponize their office to humiliate and dehumanize. The momentum rippled. Presley stood at the Capitol steps flanked by supporters and delivered a thunderous rebuke. "We are not asking for civility," she said. "We are demanding accountability." Ilhan Omar's voice cracked during a press briefing as she recalled her own experiences with public dehumanization. "This isn't about partisanship," she said. "This is about the line and how far past it he stepped." And AOC didn't mince a single syllable when asked by a reporter if the Democratic Party was overreacting. "Overreacting," she shot back. "What would you call it when a woman is stripped of her identity, her history, and her humanity on national television, and we're supposed to just move on because he wears a flag pin?" That same day, over 42 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and key allies in the Women's Caucus signed on to a public resolution condemning J.D. Vance's conduct. The language was brutal, deliberate, and surgically aimed. This chamber must never normalize cruelty as discourse. Overnight, the line between political loyalty and moral clarity began to buckle under the weight of the moment. News anchors posed the question no one expected to ask in an election year: can a vice president be censured for verbal misconduct? The conversation had shifted. What started as an insult was now a test not of Crockett's resilience, but of the system's soul. And as the roar of political fallout echoed through Capitol Hill, the storm finally entered its most volatile terrain, a federal courtroom. What had begun as a televised insult had evolved into a legal trial, with the eyes of a fractured nation locked on one question: when power is used to humiliate, can the law still speak louder? The courthouse in downtown Washington, D.C. stood like a monument to consequence. On this morning, its granite columns cast long shadows across Constitution Avenue, as if the building itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The plaza was swarmed by satellite trucks, journalists, wrapped in coats despite the early autumn heat, and a crowd of citizens holding signs, some calling for justice, others clinging to silence. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, every seat taken by attorney students, civil rights historians, and exhausted staffers who knew they were no longer witnessing process but precedent. The feed was live broadcasting coast to coast. Over 11 million Americans were watching in real time. Not just a courtroom, a crucible. J.D. Vance entered first, flanked by three attorneys known for defending billionaires and breaking settlements. He wore a tailored gray suit, but it did little to hide the storm behind his eyes. Not anger, not shame, but a kind of hollow calculation. His face was locked, his steps stiff. He nodded at no one. He didn't speak. The courtroom didn't greet him. They only watched like an audience, unsure if they were about to witness a defense or a dissent. He took his seat without ceremony, his fingers interlaced, white-knuckled and still. Then the doors opened again, and Jasmine Crockett walked through. She didn't need security. She didn't need spectacle. Her presence spoke for itself. A fitted black blazer wrapped her frame like armor. Her gold-rimmed glasses glinted beneath the overhead lights, and in her arms she carried a red folder, thick as a legal brick, 200 pages of testimony, internal communications, fact-check transcripts, expert declarations, and media analyses. She moved with grace, sharpened into purpose. Each step echoed like a drumbeat through the vaulted chamber. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't need to. Her eyes were fixed forward, not on vengeance, but on record. As she sat, her hands calmly placed the red folder on the table. No shaking, no hesitation. This was not a woman seeking vindication. This was a woman delivering it. When the judge entered, the room dropped into silence so total it felt like oxygen had been pulled from the air. An elder jurist with a reputation for brutal clarity and zero tolerance for grandstanding, he took his time scanning the room. His gaze stopped briefly on Crockett, then on Vance. Then he spoke, and the gavel hadn't even fallen yet. but his words were a verdict of their own. This case is not about ideology, he said, voice as smooth as iron. It is about the ethical limits of power when spoken aloud. No one breathed, no one blinked. There were no opening statements yet, no exhibits entered into evidence. But in that moment, something tectonic had shifted. This wasn't about what was said. It was about who believed they had the right to say it and who refused to let that go unchallenged. And after the judge's voice cleaved the courtroom in two separating politics from power noise from truth, the silence was broken not by thunder, but by a calm request. Jasmine Crockett's lead attorney stood with the poise of someone who knew the difference between performance and precision. No grand gestures, no raised voice, just a single sentence spoken like a blade being unsheathed. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but laced with voltage. With the court's permission, we asked to introduce audio evidence obtained during the plaintiff's last televised appearance, with the defendant captured through a concealed microphone embedded in her earpiece worn for accessibility and transcription purposes. There was a moment brief charged where the entire room seemed to tilt forward. J.D. Vance's legal team stiffened, one whispering behind a stack of folders, but they didn't object. They couldn't. The request was legal, the source admissible, and everyone in the room, including Vance himself, already knew what was coming. The judge nodded once. A silent cue. The technician moved to the terminal like a soldier approaching detonation. The screen remained blank, but the courtroom speakers came alive with a faint hiss, that subtle electric anticipation of something about to explode. Then it came. J.D. Vance's voice. Crisp, clear, unmistakable. All we need is for her to blow up and we win. Someone like her is easy. You just push and push until the reaction writes the headline for you. The words didn't echo. They detonated. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't require interpretation because the malice is built into the architecture of the syllables. He hadn't been caught off guard. He hadn't spoken in error. This wasn't a heated moment. It was cold strategy, a chess move cloaked in condescension designed to manufacture collapse. In 10 seconds, he admitted not only to provocation, but to preying on a black woman's pain for political spectacle. The courtroom froze. No coughs, no scribbles, no shifting chairs. One juror, a black woman in her late 50s, hands clasped tightly in her lap, pressed her lips shut so hard they whitened. She didn't flinch, but her eyes glistened. A male intern in the media gallery stared down at his notepad, not writing, just stunned. And in the defense seat, J.D. Vance's body changed. His back hunched slightly. His face fell. His shoulders sank as though the weight of his own voice had finally landed. He didn't look up. He didn't meet the judge's eyes. He simply lowered his gaze, not out of remorse, but out of exposure. And as the echo of J.D. Vance's voice faded from the courtroom speakers, that brutal recording laid bare for the nation, his defense team moved with visible urgency, like men trying to stitch a wound before the bleeding reached the floor. His lead attorney stood clearing his throat with the practiced calm of someone used to walking back the unspeakable. That recording, he said, voice firm, but thinning at the edges, was taken out of context. It reflects internal strategy, not defamation. A campaign tactic, not a personal attack. He spoke quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could outrun truth. This is politics, he added, with clipped precision, not libel. Not every sharp word is slander. He paused, scanning the jury as if daring them to separate cruelty from calculation. But the silence that followed wasn't assent. It was rejection. His words landed like plastic over fire. They didn't soothe. They suffocated. Everyone in the room could feel it. They weren't watching a defense, they were watching a retreat. Then, with devastating timing, Crockett's counsel rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or dramatize. He simply turned, tapped a key on the courtroom monitor, and brought up a document that froze the oxygen in the chamber. It was an email, plain, clinical, but venomous in its simplicity. Subject line: push buttons, hard, make her scream. Header timed: provocation. Make her snap on camera. Dated 3 days before the hearing. Sent from a senior staffer on Vance's communications team. Reviewed. Approved. The room reacted not with noise, but with gravity, a collective realization, sinking in like cement. This wasn't theory. This wasn't reaction. This was a blueprint. A planned emotional ambush aimed at a sitting congresswoman of color and disguised as debate. The phrase "make her scream" flickered on the screen for an extra breath, just long enough for the jury to absorb its full weight. This, the lawyer said, voice cutting through the silence like glass through cloth, is not strategy. This is orchestration. This is targeted humiliation engineered at the highest level of government media operations. J.D. Vance didn't object. His attorney didn't respond. Neither could, because the document spoke for itself, because the truth wasn't just audible anymore, it was visible, undeniable, institutionalized. And Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't glance at the screen. She'd already lived the line those men had written. She had walked into that hearing knowing they wanted her to break, and she hadn't. Now with the world watching, the proof wasn't in her voice. It was in his plan to silence it. And as the courtroom still simmered with the fallout of the exposed email, push buttons hard, make her scream, there was no pause, no breath, no refuge for J.D. Vance. What followed wasn't just legal procedure, it was reckoning. The next act belonged to cross-examination, and it was clear from the moment Crockett's lead counsel stepped forward, this wouldn't be a volley of abstract legal theory. It would be a scalpel slicing into the machinery of manipulation lived before the American public. The attorney approached slowly with a single page in hand, no binder, no prop, just a plain sheet printed in black ink, folded once along the middle. His walk was unhurried, his face unreadable, but the tension in the room had begun to crackle again, like an old wire holding back a flood. The jury was alert. Reporters leaned forward, and J.D. Vance, now seated in the witness chair beneath oath, adjusted his posture ever so slightly, a twitch in his collar, a glance at his lawyer. A dry swallow caught under the microphone. The attorney stopped a measured distance from the stand. His voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. A quiet precision meant not to provoke but to expose. "Mr. Vance," he began, "did you ever say in any internal meeting or communication, 'This is an opportunity to discredit people like her'?" The words dropped with surgical accuracy, not a question, but a trap laid bare. And Vance knew it. He hesitated, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way trained liars do, a microsecond too long, before answering. His fingers tapped the edge of the wooden platform, his gaze lowered for a beat, and when he looked up again, his voice had a forced steadiness, the tone of someone rehearsing neutrality. "I don't recall specifically." The room didn't move. It didn't need to. The dishonesty wasn't in what he said, it was in how carefully he didn't say more. The phrase "I don't recall" didn't exonerate him, it incriminated him by omission. It screamed deflection. On the juror's bench, a woman with silver braids folded her arms, her brows tightened. To her and to many watching across the country, that answer wasn't an uncertainty, it was a pattern. Before the counsel could press further, it happened. Jasmine Crockett stood. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait for permission. She stood because the moment demanded it. Because truth sometimes doesn't request a microphone, it walks into the room and dares silence to challenge it. She took one step forward. Her black suit, sharp as a blade, caught the fluorescent lighting. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't glance at the jury. Her eyes never left J.D. Vance. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "The issue isn't that you forgot, Mr. Vance. It's that you've done it so many times you don't even notice anymore." Her voice was iron draped in velvet. Controlled. Controlled the way a dam controls a flood. Each word was its own gavel. The force of them wasn't in volume, it was in the unbearable weight of accuracy. The moment didn't erupt. It constricted. The entire courtroom seemed to shrink around her words. You could hear the tightening of breath, the subtle click of a camera lens adjusting the soft rasp of a notepad being clutched harder by a reporter. J.D. Vance didn't respond. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. But his body betrayed him in other ways, the tightening at the corner of his mouth, the sudden rigidity in his shoulders, the involuntary twitch in the corner of his left eye. He had walked into that courtroom armed with legalese and plausible deniability. But Crockett's sentence, that one measured sentence, had broken through every layer of performance. Because it wasn't just about him, it was about every man in every room who had ever cloaked condescension in strategy. Every insult framed as policy, every smear passed off as debate, every attempt to reduce a woman of color into an emotional caricature so she could be dismissed before she was heard. J.D. Vance didn't have to remember that line because he didn't believe it was wrong when he said it. And that was the point. Crockett's words didn't merely rebuke, they revealed. She wasn't accusing him of a single remark. She was indicting the entire system that allowed men like him to weaponize decorum while practicing degradation. She was speaking not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been baited, dismissed, talked over, or pushed to the edge so their passion could be turned into ammunition against them. The courtroom remained frozen. The judge didn't interrupt. The jury didn't flinch. Even the defense attorney seated beside Vance said nothing, his pen hovering an inch above the legal pad forgotten. And still Crockett didn't move. She stood there, the embodiment of composure beneath assault, and let the silence after her words do the work of 1,000 rebuttals. She didn't need a ruling in that moment. She didn't need permission, because the truth had already landed. And for the first time since this trial began, J.D. Vance looked like a man who knew he had already lost something far bigger than a case. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed like a quiet blade through the marble bones of that courtroom, the air seemed to hold its breath, not out of fear, but reverence. 4 days passed. 4 days where no sound escaped the jury room, no leaks reached the press, no certainty settled into the bones of anyone watching. 17 hours a day, the networks ran nothing but analysis, speculation, reaction. Legal experts debated strategy. Civil rights historians spoke in hushed tones. Talk shows turned solemn. And the American public, usually quick to forget, remembered. They remembered the smirk. They remembered the email. They remembered the point of his finger and the stillness of her gaze. And they waited. Inside that jury room, 12 men and women wrestled not just with facts, but with weight. They stared down pages of transcripts and audio recordings. They replayed clips, zoomed in on expressions, debated motives. But what hung over every line, every exhibit, was something heavier than the law intent. This wasn't about a single moment. It was about erosion, about what happens when power becomes accustomed to humiliating the ones it sees as expendable and expects applause for the performance. And after nearly 90 hours behind closed doors, the door opened. The judge entered, first robes trailing behind him like consequence. His face was unreadable, his presence grave. A clerk stood with a sealed envelope in hand, thin, unassuming, and yet heavier than anything else in the room. The judge accepted it, sliced it open, unfolded the verdict, with the same reverence one might unfold a flag handed to a grieving family. He read it silently, then looked up. The world leaned in. His voice was steady, but something in its evenness made the room colder. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." The words didn't roar. They didn't need to. They hit like a slow, deliberate hammer. A tremor ran through the gallery. Reporters blinked. One dropped a pen. The defense table went rigid. The judge continued. "We find that the defendant, Vice President J.D. Vance, engaged in a systemic defamation and abused his position of power to publicly humiliate his political opponent with calculated intent." There it was. In one sentence, not just guilt, but intention. The jury hadn't merely ruled that J.D. Vance lied. They ruled that he weaponized his office with the precision of a scalpel and the cruelty of someone who believed himself untouchable. This wasn't about slander. It was about systematized humiliation. Then the final blow fell. "We award damages in the amount of $100 million. The number hit like a tectonic shift. Gasps spread across the chamber like heat. A woman in the third row clasped her hand to her chest. A man on the press bench whispered Jesus under his breath before catching himself. The figure was not a suggestion. It was a declaration. 100 million. Not simply to compensate, but to punish, to mark the moment, to ensure no one mistook silence for permission ever again. At the defense table, J.D. Vance didn't flinch, but that was the tell. The stillness was not strength, it was shell shock. His hands clasped in front of him, as if in prayer, but his eyes had gone glassy, unfocused. One of his attorneys leaned toward him, whispered something quick and sharp, but Vance didn't respond. For the first time in this entire ordeal, the hearings, the backlash, the lawsuit, the courtroom. He looked small, not physically, existentially, as if the air itself had withdrawn its allegiance. The cameras shifted, refocused, turned now not to him, but to the woman who never raised her voice. Jasmine Crockett sat still, perfectly still, as if absorbing the moment would take time, as if justice, when it finally arrived, was heavier than she imagined. Her gold-rimmed glasses reflected the courtroom lights, obscuring her eyes just long enough to make the silence sacred. Then she closed them, slowly, deliberately. A long blink that didn't mean fatigue, it meant memory. When she opened them again, her mouth moved. No microphone, no amplification. But those closest to her heard it, and those farthest from her felt it. This is for my mother. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The courtroom understood. America understood. Because this wasn't just a verdict. It was a restoration. It was for every woman who had ever been baited until her passion was weaponized against her. For every black mother whose restraint was mistaken for weakness. For every daughter who had to build armor before she learned how to speak. This was not revenge. It was remembrance. And in that moment, the number didn't matter. The cameras didn't matter. Even the courtroom itself, for a breath, disappeared. All that remained was one voice, one line, and the weight of a history that had finally spoken back. And as the courthouse emptied into dusk and history cooled beneath the echo of the gavel, America did not move on. It leaned forward, because something seismic had happened, not just in the courtroom, but in the bloodstream of a country used to watching power escape consequence. Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground and won, but she didn't retreat to silence. She stepped into something even more dangerous than justice purpose. The press conference had been scheduled only hours after the verdict, but the crowd outside had already doubled, then tripled. The air was thick with anticipation, not noise. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder on the courthouse steps. Boom mics jutted into space like rifles. Cameramen argued over angles. Staffers whispered instructions into earpieces while adjusting the podium, which stood bare under a midday sun that suddenly felt brighter, sharper, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. Then the doors opened. Jasmine Crockett walked out, not with a security detail, but with her silence. Not with swagger, but with stillness. Her black suit was immaculate, tailored, and deliberate. Her posture was unshakable. The gold-rimmed glasses rested once more across the bridge of her nose, but this time they caught the light differently, not as a shield, but as a reflection. Behind her, no entourage, only truth. Before her, dozens of cameras. Beyond those cameras, a nation waiting not to hear a victory lap, but a reckoning. She approached the microphone, slowly scanning the crowd, not with triumph, but with clarity. Every lens focused, every throat closed. The atmosphere was taut, ready to snap. Her voice, when it came, didn't rush. It didn't plead, it didn't thunder. But it carried like scripture written for fire. I didn't sue because I'm weak, she said, her tone crisp, her words scalpel clean. I sued to remind this country that every person, even on the battlefield of politics, deserves to be treated with dignity. The sentence landed like a gavel of its own. You could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the way even the photographers stopped clicking for one beat too long. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Because this wasn't performance. It was memory sharpened into a weapon. She paused, letting the silence fill in everything the verdict didn't say. And then she stepped aside, revealing something in her hand, a thick, unbranded folder worn at the edges, held not like a prop, but like a declaration. This, she said, holding it above the podium so every lens could catch it, is the founding document of a new political fund. Murmurs rippled, eyes widened. Someone at the front tried to ask a question, but a single gesture from her stopped it cold. It's called Power Without Permission. She continued, voice low but cutting, and it's dedicated to building the political futures of black and brown women who've been told they need to wait their turn, lower their voice, or swallow their rage. No cheering, no clapping. Just impact, the kind of impact that doesn't invite applause, only action. Because everyone knew what she meant. Every word had been earned. Every syllable had been forged in the fire she'd just walked through and survived. She placed the folder on the podium with a finality that said, "This is only the beginning." Then she looked up, eyes scanning the crowd once more. Let me be clear, she said, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once. This isn't charity. This is structure. This is armor. This is blueprint. Each sentence hit like a rising drumbeat, the rhythm of rebuilding. I'm done asking for space in a room I've already earned, she said. And I want every young girl watching this to know your passion is not a liability. It is proof you're alive in a system that expects your silence. Reporters stared. No one moved. In the front row, a young black woman with a press badge lowered her phone and just watched wide-eyed. Behind her, a veteran political journalist whispered, "She's rewriting the rules." Jasmine didn't wait for questions. She didn't stay for commentary. She turned and stepped away from the podium and walked back inside, not because she was retreating, but because she had delivered. And in that delivery, she'd done something that not even the $100 million verdict could do alone. She'd built a bridge, not to sympathy, but to strategy, not to anger, but to empowerment. She had taken every insult, every microaggression, every pointed finger and smirking dismissal, and turned them into the foundation of a movement that would bear her name only once and then outgrow her entirely. Power without permission. It was no longer just a fund, it was a warning. It was a promise. And it was the one sentence J.D. Vance would never be able to outvote. The silence after the press conference was deceptive, a stillness only history recognizes. But Washington never stays quiet for long. Less than 3 days after the verdict, as the media obsession over Jasmine Crockett's courtroom triumph reached a boiling point, the political machinery behind the curtain began to rattle. Inside a marble-paneled chamber on Capitol Hill, the Senate Subcommittee on Governmental Ethics convened an unannounced emergency session. The target Vice President J.D. Vance. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reckoning. Allegations weren't merely focused on defamation anymore. Committee members pored over internal documents, email chains, and audio files, previously sealed the same ones used in court to prove intent. But here the stakes were constitutional. J.D. Vance, as vice president, had been vested with oversight of the Federal Communications Commission, a powerful seat controlling the balance of public messaging media regulation and digital communication policy. After reviewing the now public court files, one senator reportedly whispered to another, he wasn't overseeing communication. He was orchestrating humiliation. Then came the motion. Direct, unambiguous, effective immediately. J.D. Vance is removed from all responsibilities relating to federal media oversight, including but not limited to chairing FCC strategy subcommittees. The final vote 11-3, not even all Republicans stood by him. When reporters learned of the decision, cameras swarmed the Capitol steps, once again hungry for another headline. But Vance didn't appear. Not this time. Instead, a terse one-line statement was released by his office through the White House press. Liaison Vice President Vance will no longer oversee the FCC or any communications-related portfolio. No elaboration, no apology, just the slow, visible unraveling of authority. And yet the more lasting blow didn't come from politics, it came from something far more enduring: education. In Upper Manhattan on the campus of Columbia University, the ripple turned into doctrine. Their prestigious law school, known for dissecting the limits of power and speech, quietly introduced a new module in its Ethics and Power in the 21st Century series. The case at the center of the syllabus, Crockett versus Vance. The course wasn't theory. It was reality archived, indexed, and dissected. Students were assigned trial transcripts, social media reactions, FCC procedural documents, and psychological profiles on how public power can be manipulated through calculated incivility. Each seminar opened with a clip, the one where J.D. Vance leaned toward his mic during the hearing and declared coldly, "Budgeting is no place for sob stories," and ended with Jasmine Crockett's whispered declaration in court, "This is for my mother." But the most quoted line, the one that earned its own slide in every final exam and its own engraved plaque outside the lecture hall, came from the Dean of Law during the course's introduction ceremony. Standing before a room of future policymakers, she faced the crowd and said, "History is not just debate, it is the choice to honor dignity when dishonored." That quote, once just a moral observation, now lived permanently above Columbia's legal archives. Back in Washington, the political winds began to shift. Staffers reworded press releases. Senators rewrote talking points. Even those who had once cheered Vance's rhetorical barbs began quietly deleting tweets, reframing interviews, and reconsidering past alliances. J.D. Vance, once seen as the sharpened voice of the new hardline establishment, had become a case study not in ideology, but in abuse. And for Jasmine Crockett, it was never just about the $100 million or the verdict or the removal of a vice president from power. It was about a national line redrawn between free speech and licensed cruelty, between disagreement and dehumanization, between history written by victors and history rewritten by those who refused to be erased. The nation had witnessed a trial, but Columbia had immortalized a transformation. And as Columbia etched her name into a permanent syllabus on the limits of speech and power, the country itself seemed to pause not in judgment, but in a collective breath of clarity. The fall of J.D. Vance was no longer just political, it was spiritual symbolic. In court he lost. But in the eyes of a nation, what collapsed was far greater, the illusion that institutional cruelty dressed in rhetoric could still go unanswered. The myth that arrogance wrapped in office was too high to reach. Jasmine Crockett didn't dismantle that myth with fire. She did it with precision, word by word, fact by fact, breath by breath. And when the camera zoomed in for the final image, her closing her eyes whispering, "This is for my mother," it wasn't performance. It was memory, generational memory. The kind that's not written in books but burned into the marrow of every woman who's ever been publicly stripped of dignity and told to smile through it. In that whisper was the echo of every time she was called aggressive, for standing firm, emotional, for caring too much, unqualified for daring to speak truth before rank. Because the truth is this, Jasmine Crockett didn't win by chance. She won because she refused to be trained out of her own voice. J.D. Vance called her TikTok wigs and delusion, but what he feared wasn't her appearance. It was her persistence, her refusal to shrink, her audacity to bring truth where power expected obedience, and more than anything, her ability to maintain control in a room that was built to unravel her. "This is for my mother." 7 words, not screamed, not sobbed, whispered. And yet they cut deeper than every slur, every smirk, every calculated insult Vance had ever hurled in his climb to the vice presidency. Because Vance, for all his bravado, didn't understand something, Crockett was born knowing that silence, when chosen, is the loudest weapon of all. She didn't sue him because she was hurt. She sued him because she refused to let power mistake cruelty for normalcy. She sued because every time a woman of color is publicly humiliated and nothing happens, a message is sent. You can be mocked, erased, and diminished, and we'll call it debate. But this time the message reversed, and the message was her. Let's be clear, this wasn't about $100 million. It wasn't even about a courtroom. It was about the soul of public life, the invisible thread that separates leadership from tyranny. J.D. Vance didn't just call her names. He leveraged government machinery to try and fracture her credibility on live television. He rehearsed insults like policy. He hid behind strategy while orchestrating humiliation. And when she didn't flinch, he escalated because fragility always lashes out when its power is questioned. "This is for my mother." It wasn't just personal, it was ancestral. For every woman who bit her tongue in the boardroom. For every teacher forced to smile through condescension. For every black girl who raised her hand in class and got silence in return. For every daughter who watched her mother apologize for existing too boldly. That whisper was for them. And that's what makes this story bigger than politics. Bigger than Jasmine. Bigger than Vance. It's about the question buried deep in every institution of power. What happens when someone refuses to perform their assigned inferiority? What happens when you confront calculated cruelty, not with outrage but with undeniable truth? Because Crockett had every reason to break. Every trap was set. They wanted her loud, uncomposed, broken. But instead she gave them something far more dangerous: stillness. The kind of stillness that makes juries lean forward. That makes cameras linger. That makes a nation listen. She never needed to raise her voice. Vance did that for her every time he interrupted, every time he pointed a finger, every time he condescended with a grin, and the voice of someone who assumed the world would always be tilted in his favor. He expected applause. He got accountability. And yet the most extraordinary part, Jasmine Crockett never asked for vengeance. She asked for acknowledgement. Her press conference said it best, and it's worth remembering word for word. I don't sue because I'm weak. I sue to remind this nation every human being deserves respect, even on the battlefield of politics. That is the core of the lesson. Not rage, not revenge, respect. The most radical demand in a system addicted to performance and pain. She didn't call for his resignation. She didn't demand prison. She demanded that the system admit what it did and pay. Not just to punish Vance, but to set a precedent, a line in the sand, a declaration that slander dressed as discourse will no longer go unanswered. Because when you let cruelty parade as commentary, you don't just fail individuals, you fail democracy. And so this case is now more than a file, it is curriculum. Columbia teaches it not for the salacious details, but for the moral line it forces students to reckon with. It doesn't ask, was she offended? It asks, where does power end and abuse begin? Because power without restraint is not strength, it's cowardice. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing but transcripts and truth, made that cowardice blink. She stood her ground. She didn't shout. She didn't crumble. She pressed play on the earpiece recording. She laid down the email chain. She asked, did you say this? And when Vance stuttered, she didn't gloat. She simply stood like every woman who has ever been told to sit back down. And in doing so, she didn't just win a case. She rewrote the terms of battle. Not every fight is about fists. Some are about refusal. Refusal to let someone else define your worth. Refusal to allow silence to become complicity. Refusal to play a role in someone else's script. This is for my mother. Not a tagline. Not a performance. A final act of reclaiming something the world tried to steal: inheritance. Not of money or legacy, but of voice. Dignity passed down, guarded through generations, and finally spoken on national television by a daughter who knew exactly what was at stake. So when future historians write about this trial, they won't write about J.D. Vance's collapse. They'll write about Jasmine Crockett's composure, her clarity, her courage to demand not just justice but remembrance. And if there is any justice left in the way stories are told, if classrooms and courtrooms remain places of truth, then let this be the final lesson. Power does not belong to those who speak loudest. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. And this, every word of it, was for her mother, for all our mothers, but for all the courtroom victories and headlines, the real battle, the one fought in office lobbies, classrooms, kitchens, and morning commutes, was only just beginning. Because what Jasmine Crockett proved under oath is what millions live without proof every single day, that power unchecked becomes permission to erase, and silence isn't always consent, it's often exhaustion. And in a world that weaponizes dignity, her case lit a fuse in places Washington never sees. Outside the courthouse, her voice echoed through more than microphones. It hit working mothers standing in grocery store lines with Medicaid denial letters folded in their purses. It hit teachers shouted down by school boards for calling out racism in textbooks. It hit teenage girls watching debate club boys repeat their points louder and get credit for originality. Jasmine didn't just fight for policy. She modeled how to fight when the system expects you to fold. Because let's be honest, most of us will never stand in a federal courtroom, but nearly all of us will sit across from someone who thinks respect is optional. And in those moments, Crockett's composure becomes a blueprint. Not for revenge, for response, for reclaiming space, for refusing to play small because someone with a title decided you don't belong. This is for my mother was not just personal, it was instructive. It taught us that you don't have to match disrespect with noise. You can respond with evidence, with stillness, with unshakable truth. That in rooms built to make you flinch, the strongest move is to not move at all. You don't scream. You unplug your silence, lay down your file, and say, play the tape. Let the truth do the yelling. Jasmine's fight shows that political humiliation isn't just a congressional issue. It's a workplace issue, a schoolyard tactic, a family dinner ambush. It's in board meetings where your suggestion is ignored until someone repeats it in a deeper voice. It's in job interviews where your hair becomes a topic. It's in every "you're too sensitive." Don't make this about race and be grateful you're even here. And what she taught us is that dignity is not given, it's defended. So what do we do with that lesson? We apply it. In emails, we rewrite with clearer boundaries. In meetings where we hold our voice steady. in conversations where we name the disrespect rather than let it skate by as banter. We remember that being disrespected doesn't mean we're weak, it means we're being targeted for our strength. And like Crockett, we choose not to absorb the attack, but to return it strategically, legally, loudly, when needed, quietly when powerful. And for those of us watching from the sidelines, unsure of how to step in when we see harm, we take our cue from the jury. We listen. We weigh the pattern, not just the moment. We recognize that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is not clap back, but hold someone accountable through process, not performance. Because in the end, the courtroom wasn't just a chamber of justice, it was a mirror. And what it reflected back to the nation was both damning and hopeful. Damning because it showed how normalized public dehumanization has become. Hopeful because it proved that a single voice armed with preparation, conviction, and an unwillingness to disappear can shift the culture. And when the cameras shut off and the headlines fade, the work doesn't end. It moves into classrooms where young people debate fairness, into living rooms where families argue about what dignity looks like, into offices where workers decide whether to stay silent or to speak. The legacy of moments like Crockett's is not only what happened in the chamber, but what echoes afterward. Each replay, each retelling becomes a seed. And if enough seeds are planted through courage, through truth, through relentless insistence that humanity is not negotiable, then the culture does more than shift, it grows. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.